So greetings from Pennsylvania once again, and welcome back to our French and Indian War series. Of course, I'm back home from my most recent trip out to Western PA, where we visited a number of French and Indian War sites, including Fort Duquesne. And in that video too, we followed Braddock's road all the way to the site of the Battle of Monongahela, which is also called the Battle of the Wilderness, or Braddock's defeat, where Braddock and the British were just utterly defeated by the French and Indians. And to be honest, if things would have been done differently, the British should have won that battle, but we'll talk about that and what happened. Now, I'm not going to get into a ton of the whole background history again. I've been talking a lot about that in previous videos. Of course, both the British and the French were trying to control the Ohio River Valley, and the forks of the Ohio, where modern-day Pittsburgh is. The English had built a fort there first, some little tiny fort called Fort Prince George, but not too long after, the French showed up and built Fort Duquesne, and then they controlled that area. So the British were trying to get them out of that area, and their first attempt to do so was by Major General Edward Braddock and the Braddock Expedition. Of course, he had to build a road all the way up to that. We filmed that in previous videos already. Then when he was not too far from there, on July 8th, I think I talked about this in another video too, on another video as well. According to some historians, on July 8th, he was met by a group of Indians the day before the battle started, and they were asking for a conference. They said the French wanted to meet for a conference. I don't think Braddock himself met with them. I think Washington and another man by the last name of Fraser met with them. They wanted the British to halt their advance to give the French an opportunity to evacuate the fort. Why would the French want to do that? Well, because the British had a superior force compared to what the French had. This was the largest army ever assembled in North America at the time. Braddock's little army there. Well, at the time it wasn't little, but by today's standards it would be. He had about 2,100 men with him, and the French had nowhere near that much. I think there was about, it's hard to say, yes, it changes. There are about 600 Indians there maybe, and maybe 250 French and Canadians roughly, so they were vastly outnumbered by the British. And there's a possibility too that it was a trap. Perhaps, maybe, who knows, maybe they're trying to just delay the British or set up an ambush or something, but the point is moot because Braddock declined to meet with them and just continued marching anyway, which perhaps he should have listened. So this battle occurred on July 9th of 1755, the last day of Braddock's expedition, obviously. They had to cross the Monongahela River twice. They crossed it the one time I showed you in that video where I followed Braddock's road, but after the second crossing, it was not too long after that that they encountered some of the French and Indians. And instead of just talking about what happened at this battle, I'm going to try and demonstrate to you what happened at this battle with little game pieces. This is from the game of Risk. Brought two different colors here. So they do have little horse cavalry pieces. Whoops. Oh, I just lost a guy down the crack there. One soldier died already. We have the artillery pieces, and of course we obviously also have the, whoops, where's the dude? Just the regular dudes. Where are you? Separate each other. There you go. Just the regular soldier dudes as well. So I'll try to use these to demonstrate what happened during the battle too. So just like I said, just yapping about it. I gotta go rescue my other guy that's down there. Alright, so here's our little setup. Up here is Fort Duquesne, which is partially collapsed. It's a bit windy out here. The rocks represent the forks of the Ohio. Here's the Monongahela. I believe that's the Allegheny. And they meet here to form the Ohio. And here's the advance guard of the British Army. You got Thomas Gage, who was leading it. About 300 men. Obviously, they don't have 300 pieces. And two cannons had already crossed the Monongahela. They were making their way this way. And they just kind of encountered a group of French and Indians who were probably setting up an ambush, although they hadn't completed it. So both parties just kind of met. It's called a meeting engagement, where you're kind of meeting at an undetermined time and location. This was not a planned battle. They just kind of ran into each other. So that's our setup here. So once they ran into each other unexpectedly, the engagement began. There was an initial skirmish, and right away I forgot to add the French commander in there, Bejo, I think his last name was, but he was killed in the initial volley. Of course, they kind of formed their lines. They started firing. They had two cannons with them. They fired their cannons, which kept the Indians at bay at first. Probably many of them had never encountered cannon fire before, the sounds, but it was quite ineffective in a situation like this. You got a picture, this was not an open field. This is all woodlands with maybe like a path right here. So trying to fire cannon in a situation like this was ineffective. I mean, the noise of it would have been effective, but once the Indians realized that they were in no danger, the wind is knocking down my men, I guess that's kind of indicative of the battle. I guess those dudes are dead now, but yeah. Even here, the British probably should have won this initial engagement, but the British thought it was an ambush. They thought there were more French here than there were, but it wasn't. Of course, after the initial exchange, some of the French Canadians went back to the fort, and their French guy just died there, ran back to the fort. I think some of the Indians took off too, but some remained. Beaujeu dies in that first volley, but the second in command, I think his name was Dumas, his last name, I'll have to double check, but he rallied the French and Indians, and they fired back. Like I said, these guys thought it was an ambush, and they retreated actually. Thomas Gage and they retreated back this way. Of course, once Thomas Gage and his men started retreating from what they thought was an ambush, they ran directly into Braddock's advancing main army, and that just created a havoc, a mess, you know. They were kind of in a nice, well-defined order. Oh, there they go, the wind's blowing them down. But they just ran into them, and it just created disorder, messed the column up. Alright, so I have had to relocate the Battle of Monongahela to another time and place. Yes, so it's now the day after from yesterday when I started filming this, but I was at that picnic table. It was actually over at Blue Marsh Lake. It was just getting so windy I couldn't keep my army up at all. Every time I got them up and a bare gust of wind would come down just as soon as I started filming and knocking me down again. It was a losing battle, another battle being lost. So I'm back here in my backyard the following day. Still a little breezy, but not down so much down this way. So let's recap what's going on and get on with this Battle of Monongahela. Once again, here's Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio. We already had our initial skirmish where Thomas Gage and his advance guard, about 300 men and 2 cannon pieces, had encountered some of the French and Indians. Of course, some of the Canadian militia had fled back to the fort. We talked about how ineffective the cannon fire was and stuff. Remember, they thought it was an ambush, but it actually wasn't. So they started fleeing back this way and ran headfirst into Braddock's main army right here and caused a whole bunch of confusion. And seeing it, these guys pursued. Yeah, so in the middle now we have the confusion. The retreating forces are running into the advancing forces, and the whole column gets a bit disorganized. And here the French and Indians are. Dumas is now leading the French. Of course, Beaujeu, the original commander, was killed in that first volley. And here's we got Braddock himself back here. So what Braddock is now going to do is he's going to fight in the conventional European battlefield way. He's going to try and form all these what they call ranks of men in what they call show order. Have everybody fight in that conventional style. And the French and Indians are going to do what they do the best out here in this area. They're going to fight what they call Indian style. And it should be noted too at this time that Braddock did not have this full force with him. He had left maybe about a third of his army, roughly, back with his second in command, Dunbar, back at what today is called Dunbar's camp. He was back there with most of the supplies and stuff, so he was not, at this point in the battle, he was not at full force. He had about maybe 1,400 men with him, but remember the French and Indians still only had maybe a combined force of 700 or 800 or so. I think there's like, 600 Indians or so, 250 French, so maybe about 850, so they were still outnumbered pretty handedly by the British. So despite the confusion, Braddock was able to get his army organized into nice little rank and file positions like they did over in Europe on those open battlefields. You notice everybody's lined up nice and filed with their officers behind them of the different companies. Like I said, that's the way they fought in Europe, but out here in the wilderness, this style of battle was completely ineffective. And this is exactly what Braddock had been warned about. I filmed that little biography about him. Remember, George Washington and Ben Franklin both warned him that, you know, fighting out here in the wilderness of Pennsylvania, or in the wilderness of the colonies out here, was vastly different than fighting a battle over on a battlefield in Europe. And of course, if you remember that video, he ignored them. He was actually very arrogant about it. When Washington counseled him, I guess you could say, he's like, what? You know, like a provincial officer's gonna tell me, you know, a European general what to do? And when Franklin mentioned it to him, he was like, yo, well, maybe your measly little, just squished a bug on my forehead, maybe your measly little colonial troops can't handle those French and Indians, but my regular troops will be able to handle it. He's very arrogant when they tried to just give him some advice on how to fight out here in the wilderness. And of course, he should have listened to them, because what happens next is exactly what they were warning him about. You notice, I mentioned he set his little army up exactly how they would over, like on a European battlefield, all nice in order. Kind of like when you see movies on the Civil War, even here in America, they would, both sides would line up and just shoot at each other in nice straight lines. It's kind of what he was lining his men up to do, but the enemy, the French and Indians, did not fight that way out here in the wilderness. In fact, it was ineffective that way completely. So once again, here we have our two armies facing off. What's going to happen? He's already lined up nicely. What they're going to start to do is to form a horseshoe around him in the woods, start sniping from the trees and stuff like they do. They're going to fight wilderness style. Alright, so here we go. Now you can see how they've lined up almost like in a horseshoe, surrounding the British army. Remember this, there's trees here though too. Trees on, this is Braddock's road right here, but there are trees on either side, which I don't have here. I could take some sticks and jam into the ground, but imagine there's trees here. So many of the Indians formed this horseshoe, and the French were more up here, but they fought from the tree line, hiding behind trees and stuff, and sniping, firing into the ranks. And you notice the British are lined up all nice in ranks with their officers in the back here, all dressed in red, most of them. So what the Indians and the French were, they're sniping the officers, knocking down the officers. And what happened is a lot of the companies, once their officers were shot down or wounded, some of them refused to fight. Kind of created more disorder. So they weren't, when they were shooting in, they were not shooting always for the regular soldiers, but for the officers. And the way Braddock was fighting was not compatible at all with the way the French and Indians were fighting. Like I said, they were hiding in the woods, hiding behind trees. So the style of lining up in a line and all shooting all at once was rather ineffective, because as soon as they started doing that, just duck behind a tree if you're the enemy. And of course, as soon as they fire, they weren't using modern weapons. Every time they fired, they had to reload, muzzle loaders. So that gave time for you to pop, if you're the enemy, to pop out from behind your tree, start sniping in to the British again, looking for those officers. So that's what happened, and eventually it caused so much disorder and stuff. And eventually Braddock himself was shot in the lung and taken off his horse, and that was pretty much it at that point then. Yeah, so once Braddock was shot off his horse, that was pretty much the end of the battle. There's a lot more confusion. George Washington is actually credited to be the one who kind of salvaged the operation there. Even though he was not a commissioned officer, he was an aide to Braddock. He kind of organized the retreat. Otherwise, it could have been even just more madness. And Braddock wasn't killed at the battle. He was mortally wounded. He was shot in the lung. Like you mentioned in other videos, he died about 4 days later. And I believe I mentioned at the beginning of this video that the British should have won this battle. They had the far superior force, vastly outnumbered the French, not just in manpower, but in supplies and weaponry. But in the end, they were utterly defeated. And this caused a ton of trouble afterwards. Obviously, it ended the whole idea of capturing Fort Duquesne, but in that fall is when a lot of the Indian raids and massacres started happening over in eastern Pennsylvania. The Great Cove Massacre, Penn's Creek Massacre, the Nadenhood Massacre. It's almost as if the Indians were emboldened by the defeat of Braddock. And they used a lot of the weapons, when they fled the battle scene, they just abandoned all their weapons and stuff, and the Indians and the French then used those weapons against the British settlers later on in some of their attacks against the defense forts. And I know when I filmed that video on Braddock, I mentioned how arrogant he was, and some people said, well, maybe he was just confident, very confident. And he definitely was confident, but he's also very arrogant. And to not listen at all to the advice of people who actually lived in the area, people like Washington who actually fought the French and the Indians out in the wilderness and knew how they fought. He should have listened to those people, but in his arrogance, he chose to do things his own way. And like Franklin had mentioned, Ben Franklin mentioned that maybe Braddock would have made a good general in the European theater, in the European battlefield where you're facing each other on an open field, but out here in the wilderness, no, not at all. And he proved that he was incapable of being a general out here in the wilderness. And I would have to think too that as you're building this road, as they made Braddock's road and he surveyed his surroundings during the whole trip towards Fort Duquesne, I feel like if you were a good general, at some point you would realize that your conventional form of fighting is not going to work in this new terrain that you're in. So you're going to realize that, you know, you're here in virgin old growth forest in the wilderness. Like I said, fighting that conventional style that you're used to in Europe, it's not going to work. And you would adapt your way of fighting and maybe consider some of the stuff you were told by the people who warned you. You would think that on his way he would realize, you know what? Maybe those people are right, you know? Maybe I should rethink the way I fight. But I feel like he was just kind of stuck in his ways and arrogant, and I don't know, I just feel like he was not a capable general at all. You kind of have to wonder why he was put in charge of, he was in command of the entire British Army in North America. I read some other articles, people wondering the same thing, why was he put in command? Because he never really had a ton of experience overall, even over in Europe, so it's kind of questionable. Yeah, so our British Army then fled back down the road they had built, Braddock's Road, or Washington kind of took charge. Of course, here's Braddock. They got pushed Braddock over. Yes, I was just looking at my notes again. I can remember that during the battle, there were probably even less than 850 of the French and Indians, because some of the Canadian militia had fled back to the fort. So there could have been, they think, maybe anywhere from 300 to 600 Indians were there, and maybe as little as 100 Frenchmen of the French Marines are actually fighting in that battle. The rest are back at the fort or in the surrounding area. So now let's talk about casualties. I'm going to read off my notes for these casualties. For the British Army, 456 killed. This is out of the 1,400 that were there, and 422 wounded. So that's a good almost, yeah, that's like half. That's over half your army killed or wounded of the 1,400 that were there. Remember I talked about them sniping the officers? Out of 86 officers, 26 were killed, 37 were wounded. Wow. And there were 50 women there, too, that acted as cooks and aides and stuff. And of 50 women, only 4 came back from that battle. So that's pretty awful. The French suffered about 8 killed and only 4 wounded. The Indians, maybe 15 killed and 12 wounded. Of course, those numbers change depending on which information you look at, so yeah. Then just some more information on the aftermath of that battle. Of course, once the British started fleeing, the French and Indians did not pursue. They could have and caused even more damage, but the Indians were content with pillaging and looting and scalping. Some of the wounded were left behind, others were taken prisoner from the British, and let's just say a lot of awful things happened that following day and into the night with some of the prisoners and stuff. But the British fled back to where Dunbar was camped, the second in command. Remember, there's another whole 700-800 men, British men there, soldiers. So when they got back to that point, they would have outnumbered the French and Indians yet. So in a sense, they could have regrouped themselves there and gone back, but they didn't. I think they're just so demoralized and defeated that they just fled. In fact, Dunbar ordered the burning of all their supply wagons, just burned everything. I think it was like 150 wagons, just burned everything, left all their supplies there, destroyed them, and they just fled back to Fort Cumberland. Which doesn't seem like the smartest thing to do, to just leave all your supplies like that, destroy them. Because the French and Indians weren't pursuing. I guess they were fearful that they would, so they just left everything, destroyed everything. Yeah. I think perhaps they could have regrouped, made a second attempt, but they would have just done things the same way. I think they just lacked solid leadership in that case as to what to do. And the French and Indians kind of lost an advantage there too. They could have pursued and caused even more damage, but remember, there was not that many of them compared to the British, and yeah, they were kind of content with, they weren't expecting the outcome that they got to begin with, I don't think, so they were kind of content with what happened. But things could go on a lot differently after the battle too, but it is what it is. All right, so I'm going to pack up my little army, put them back into their respective little boxes there. So we'll pack up the army, and we'll pack up this video too. So that is the Battle of Monongahela, the battle in the wilderness, Braddock's defeat. Just a summary of the battle. You can, obviously, if you want to know more about what happened, you can read more online. But that's just a summary of what happened. Disastrous defeat. And as always, thanks for coming along, and I'll see you on the next one.